Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today I'm going to talk with some of my friends about some of the big news of the day, as well as of the year and as of the last 3 years. That is, the wars that the U.S. is not engaging in, but definitely having a position on. And that is especially the wars in Ukraine and in Gaza. But we have many other issues on our minds because last night there was big news of a big confrontation in the Oval Office between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky. So that's the news of the day. So I have my Pugwash friends here. Robin Collins is in Ottawa. Paul Meyer is, I think, in Vancouver. Is that right? And Adele Buckley is here in Toronto, at least north of Toronto. So all of you are very engaged with the Canadian Pugwash group and no doubt have opinions and information to share about foreign policy, world affairs, etc. Who wants to kick this off?
Alphabetical order.
Well, you're already speaking, so your camera's on you, Paul, and you're it.
Yeah, well, it's clear that for those who are involved in the Canadian Pugwash movement and the mission of which is to try to counter existential threats to humanity and nuclear weapons and climate change have figured prominently on that over years, and I think broadly wish to see international law respected globally, that there be peaceful resolutions of disputes. We'll always have conflicts in the world, but the key thing I believe, both domestically and internationally, is managing those conflicts and ideally resolving them through peaceful means, whether that's through the ballot box or through mediation, conciliation, all the other tools for the peaceful settlement of disputes. Which I like to remind people, it's not just desirable, but actually it's an obligation for all member states under the UN Charter that they sort of exhaust all of those approaches and refrain from the use of force in their international relations. So that's the orientation. I think it's probably not an exaggeration to say some of these values are being seriously challenged right now in the international arena. And it behooves, I think, all of us to see what we can do to try to reestablish that system around the peaceful settlement of disputes, around reducing military expenditures to the minimum levels necessary for defense, to try to affect progress in reducing nuclear weapon arsenals and other weapons of mass destruction. It's never been an easy road to hoe, so to speak, and we have to, though I believe, avoid despair and be creative in looking for opportunities to make progress in these very crucial goals for humanity.
Mm-hmm. I don't think anybody's going to argue with you. The question is, if the devil's in the details.
Yeah, that's the biggest problem. I was just listening to Neil Ferguson in an interview on a podcast just came out, and he's a conservative realist historian. I'm not his greatest fan, but he in the conversation. He has written some interesting stuff, but in the conversation he was saying he understood Trump and his actions up until a few weeks ago as a rational actor in a sense. And he was even willing to listen to his alleged pursuance of peace in the Ukraine and so on. And he said, then we hear him speaking of Zelensky as the dictator, as Ukraine starting the war, and Zelensky having 4% of popular support. And he started to wonder exactly what was going on here. Was there a rational actor here, or something else motivating him? And
Excuse me, but let me interrupt. I don't think I understood you. Zelensky has 4% approval ratings? What do you say?
no, this is what Trump said. So the point that Ferguson was making was he was going along for the ride with Trump, not really knowing where it was heading, but assuming he had sort of a realist perspective. America's national interest was the dominant player, and then he started making these claims, all of which are clearly incorrect. Ukraine did not start the war. Zelensky has greater than 4%. I think he had something like 52% support in a real poll, and so on. And so the point I was going to make was, we have a tendency to dismiss Trump for obvious reasons, including yesterday's reasons, because he's on the wrong side of our belief system, even liberal internationalism or whatever our perspective is. If he were to succeed in a fair peace in Ukraine, in reduction of nuclear weapons, a cut of 50% of military spending, none of us would actually object to that.
Mhm.
So we have to be very careful that we don't, throw everything out, because funny things happen sometimes, and not as praise. This isn't praise for Trump. This is keeping our eye on the ball as to what's possible. And we're always playing with this peace versus justice thing. The concern about giving in to Putin's demands on Ukraine, this so-called appeasement, is that there's a fear that this will encourage Putin to go further, and may encourage others because there's no resistance. But the other side of this is the death that happens absent the peace. And so these two things are in competition with one another.
Okay.
I think if we go back to yesterday's spat, one of the things that Trump was doing was saying to Zelensky that he was inviting World War III. And well, there's at least a certain gem of little bit of truth in this, which is pretty worrying. The other thing is that it's pretty well known that Trump pulls numbers out of the air that have no basis in fact at all. So he just cites any number that appeals to him for the particular situation he's in. And certainly with respect to even the current trade war issues in Canada, the numbers are crazy, and the border issues, the numbers are also crazy, and he does not seem susceptible to actually having real numbers presented to him and actually adjusting his numbers, which is pretty maddening, because we expect that political figures will have some element of truth to what they say. So that's one thing. The other thing I'd just like to mention, because we are a Pugwash group, is that International Pugwash, or the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, were founded with the idea of influencing government policy. Now, what is it that Pugwash could do to influence government policy?
What policy would we like to promote if we had all the power in the world right now? You know, I'd like to answer that. How many people would simply go? Do we know any members of Pugwash, for example, who would say, "Well, let's just do whatever Trump and Putin want," because that's really what Trump is doing, is saying, whatever Putin wants, I'll give him, basically.
Yeah, some irony there, obviously, in him accusing Zelensky of gambling with World War III. I mean, is it the leader of a country standing up to aggression that is responsible for World War III, or would it rather be the power, the nuclear armed power that is engaged in naked aggression against the sovereign state? This is not atypical of Trump in the sense of blaming the victim for their circumstances. So
now, would he?
It's also a reminder, yeah, I mean, Neville Chamberlain, back in 1938, probably could tell the Czechoslovak Prime Minister Beneš, by holding on to your sovereignty and your territorial integrity, you are threatening World War II. And indeed, he probably that was coming regardless. And indeed, it might have ended sooner if Britain and France had honored their alliance commitments to the political independence and territorial integrity of Czechoslovakia, which was not an insignificant military power at the time. So, I mean, there's a really a danger in, as I've said before, feeding the appetites of aggressive despots, because it doesn't end their desires to acquire more and more power and the territory of others and their resources, but increases it.
I'm not very good at reading Trump's mind, but so somebody else do it for me. What would he say in justification of his assertion that it was really Zelensky who started the war? He said such a thing, but what in the world could he say in defense of that argument?
There's one nuanced interpretation of that comment. If you listen to it carefully, I mean, I think you can certainly take from it what you just said, that he's arguing that Ukraine started the war. There's another way of actually interpreting what he said, which is that you started it, referring to, arguably, some have said, not committing to Minsk, not making the appropriate concessions, for autonomous areas in eastern Ukraine, and I don't know. That's a very generous interpretation of what Trump said, because almost everybody is saying he said you started the war, and that's clearly not true, because we are talking about the invasion of Ukraine wholesale. We're not talking. Generally speaking, the conversation wasn't about what reasonable compromises could have been made, in 2014 to 2022 or whatever, right? So. Anyway, I think that's the most generous interpretation of what Trump said. But I'm not going to buy into it either way. I don't know if that's what he meant, because he's all over the place.
Think of J.D. Vance and his aggressive stance lately in both Europe and just yesterday. That's unexpected, I guess, in the vice president. They've mostly been relatively quiet, but not this one.
Well, it seemed like a tag team event yesterday, where Vance was backing up the president and, calling on. It's a very American first kind of, how dare you come here and insult us? You haven't thanked us. It was it was pretty offensive and lowbrow, to say the least. But we're not talking about we're not talking about academics here. These are posturing politicians with who knows what in mind.
Yeah, I would say along those lines that Vance, I think, is the ideologue of the group. Trump doesn't have fixed ideas, I think, beyond very broad sort of grievances that he feels somehow the United States has been taken advantage of by other countries. And his also, in my mind, inexplicable, but I think quite clear orientation towards strongmen around the world. It's like he wants to join their ranks as an autocrat. He doesn't have to worry about any kind of constraints on their will. And I mean, this romance with Vladimir Putin, seems to fit that picture. He's very mercurial. Everyone knows that. He's sort of sees himself, of course, as the great deal maker. Everything gets kind of reduced to transactional relations. He doesn't mind if he blows up long-standing real relationships with his friends and allies in order to effect some short-term deal. So I think we have to keep in mind those two very kind of different strains in American foreign policy under this administration. I mean, Vance went to Europe and basically said the security issue is not Russia, China, it's your liberal democracy, and you should end those. I mean, he's an exponent of illiberal democracy, and I think we can't explain that away. That as a certain strain in the MAGA movement, and Vance is obviously very well educated and fairly articulate champion of it, but it doesn't, of course, render it any more conducive to actually maintaining alliances. It's become a kind of a cliche. Often the U.S. saw its advantage strategically was in its alliances. I mean, China doesn't have allies. Russia can only bring Belarus and North Korea to its side. I mean, the vast majority of states were more aligned with the market capitalism, liberal democratic themes, though liberal democracy does seem to be slipping globally in a number of ways. So Trump, of course, has in his approach kind of thrown that approach to U.S. foreign policy under the bus. And I think it's going to cause grievous harm. And as someone was saying the other day, you can destroy a relationship very quickly, but to build one up, a relationship of trust, takes a long time. And I fear that some of those key relationships are being jettisoned now and will not readily recover.
If we look at along those lines, we look at the demands of Trump and friends to allies to carry their own ball in terms of security. There's definitely a disruption of NATO. Maybe even withdrawal from NATO by the U.S. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch, but maybe that's certainly the threat. What's going to come out of this, no doubt, and it seems to be showing already, is that Europe will be increasing their own regional defense spending to fill the gap. But they no doubt want the U.S. as a backstop in the event of Russia continuing beyond Ukraine, which may or may not happen. We don't know. Nobody should claim they know what Russia will do. It could be that they have all they want. That is, Putin has all that he wants. So the question comes back to what would a peace deal look like, considering all these components, which are some of them very unpleasant. So I would imagine that Ukraine joining NATO is off the table. I never thought that was a major problem in terms of Putin's reasoning for invasion in the first place. Autonomy in, well, actually, absorption of the east of Ukraine into Russia, that may not be popular for all of eastern Ukraine down the road. Putin's not going to live forever. Maybe that can be readjusted or reevaluated. I liked the op-ed that Walter Dorn, one of our members, also had in the New York Times a little while ago, last summer maybe it was, and I didn't agree with all of it because I think he was suggesting that Ukraine should join NATO, and I don't think that's actually necessary if you have security guarantees by other means. But he'd said that what might be possible is that some of the territory that's been illegally seized by Putin could be recognized temporarily, but never officially, as is the case in other parts of the world. And that would be just a delay to stop the war. And with the assumption that someday down the road, that would be returned, at least to a referenda in Ukraine as to what's that, or the people living in that area, in that zone, what they actually would want to do. That seemed to me a reasonable possibility. Ukraine joining the European Union but not NATO seemed another reasonable possibility. And these may still be possible, all of the above.
With regard to the potential ceasefire, it seems so obvious that there should be some security guarantees so that Ukraine would have the assurance that Russia would not turn around and come back again, in a month or two. But Trump seemed oblivious to that. How could that possibly be explained as
He
normal stuff in peace agreements?
Who would provide the security guarantees? I think that's the question. Trump is saying, I'm not going to give you any more weapons or whatever. I want more sort of maybe not isolationist, but America first attitude. As some have pointed out, it's in America's interests for stability in Europe. So the complete withdrawal doesn't make a realist sense either. But if U.S. wasn't going to backstop if there was further aggression by Russia, then it would be Europe. And is Europe willing to go to that extent? In our Pugwash framework, these are inconvenient discussions because we are opposed to aggression. We're also opposed to disarmament. Come up against.
Sorry?
Sorry, we're in support of disarmament. Sorry, I missed that one. We're opposed to an arms race, is what I meant to say. We're opposed to nuclear weapons. So how do these things happen if you have an aggressor on the loose? Right? My feeling has always been we want these new security frameworks. We want the disarmament and so on. But in the absence of it, then bad things will happen. And so we don't have control of that. That's not what we're advocating for. But nation states will kick in as they wish if there's an aggressor on the loose. And it doesn't matter how idealistic we are, that will happen. So that's why we have to work on these other measures, conflict resolution, get them talking, get them to diplomacy. And yesterday was not what I would call diplomacy. It's a form of diplomacy. Maybe, Paul, you can comment more on, what happens when you have that sort of crazy talk.
A resident diplomat by training, background, and everything else. So, Paul, as a diplomat, what kind of rating would you give the confrontation that we witnessed yesterday?
Well, I would give it a failing rating. I think it was actually a rather shameful display of U.S. Bullying, this leader of singular courage in standing up against the odds with his nation against aggression, and he should have been commended, not criticized for that stance. But it was also, as I mentioned just before we started, our dangers whenever one engages in what's called sometimes megaphone diplomacy, and there's a good reason why. While candid exchanges should always be encouraged, they also are best held behind closed doors, so that in a sense, the status and standing of states are not, publicly dragged, through the mud and provoke, necessary reactions. I know some have sort of scolded for Zelensky for, quote, rising to debate, because I do think it was a provocation. But I can also understand that he didn't want to sit there biting his tongue when some of the ridiculous allegations were being directed at him and his struggle, and the complete refusal to acknowledge that Russia was responsible for this war, and to talk about a peace deal without any kind of reference to, well, what is Washington doing to assert leverage on Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin to make concessions as part of an eventual ceasefire deal. We've never heard that emerge. It's like he's only interested in exerting, mafioso-like leverage on the weaker partner to extract gains from them. So it is, I think, a fairly really, bordering on despicable display of bully tactics vis-a-vis what should be an ally and partner in the fight to preserve the international legal order.
I heard no discussion of topics that had been brought up by Zelensky, such as prisoner exchange. And of course, early on in the war, a sort of large number of Ukrainian children just disappeared into Russia. Again, that was a non-topic. I mean, how many non-topics can you have? And what did Zelensky think when he mentioned that you're lucky to have this great big ocean? That was the yesterday argument. What would Russia possibly do in some future imagined strength of Russia? I just can't see Russia coming across the Atlantic Ocean to the U.S., but who knows?
I saw some interpretation of that line. I don't know if it was Levin or somebody else, but whoever it was said possibly what was meant was by Zelensky was if you abandoned your allies and you go down this road with Putin, then you will be at risk as well. He wasn't necessarily the argument went in this commentary. The argument wasn't necessarily that Russia was going to invade the U.S., who is protected by two oceans. It was there will be repercussions, economic, political, allies wise and otherwise, if you let Putin off the hook. I think that was what he was. That's one way of interpreting what he meant. Because it didn't seem like Adele. I agree. I didn't think it was a sensible argument that Putin was about to launch missiles at Washington.
I would like to speculate a bit about what we can expect to have happen next. I mean, when Zelensky stomps out of the White House, he takes along with him the unsigned document that was going to, make all the difference. But he's counting now. Is he going to be able to continue the war? Are the Europeans going to back him? Does he have any possibility of holding on very much longer? I'd like your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, he immediately went to London, and I think it was noteworthy that after that debacle in the Oval Office, almost uniformly, Canada and European allies voiced their support for Zelensky and his cause. And there's kind of another emergency meeting to be held tomorrow in London of that grouping. And I don't think we can overstate the significance of this juncture in time in terms of its implications for the transatlantic partnership, which has been fundamental for 75 plus years. I thought it was quite striking that Kaja Kallas, the High Representative for Foreign Policy with the EU, said it's time for the free world to find another leader. There's going to be this requirement for that European support to be translated into in a much more concrete manner than it has been to date, and it's without what is referred to as military enablers that the U.S. has traditionally provided to Europe. It's going to be very, very difficult for the Europeans to come up to the plate with all that is required. I think it's helpful to recall that even the Brits and the French offering some of their forces to be on the ground in Ukraine was in a particular context or scenario where there was a peace or at least a ceasefire agreement in force that the parties were expected to follow, and that this would be a limited ground force to basically observe the compliance with the terms of that ceasefire, less really, I think, a deterrent force as a monitoring force, a minor tripwire. And even then, as Starver made explicit, on the assumption that the U.S. would have their backs, that it would be supported by the U.S., even if there was not direct deployments of U.S. forces to Ukraine. These essential surveillance, intelligence, airlift coordination, all these other functions that the U.S. military provides and traditionally has provided within NATO. So if that changes and it's not a kind of agreed ceasefire, but some sort of prolongation of the fighting, what will be the European contribution? Can it just stay at the level of arms? Because even their industry is finding it very difficult to sustain the sort of levels of production. Definitely, it will not readily be able to make up the gap if the U.S. stops its flow of armaments there. And frankly, it would be difficult for the Europeans now, I think, to field a credible military force in Ukraine as an actual deterrent force that would be prepared to push further Russian invasion back. So it's, in a way, a critical moment for the Europeans. It's not like their political objectives have changed. They remain very constant, but a new calculation that takes the U.S. Factor out of it, and what can Europe do to try to make up that gap in a way and to go forward. So I'll be There's many times I would like to have been a fly on the wall in some of these meetings, but I would very much like that for tomorrow's session in London.
There was I think it was a Fox News interview with Zelensky following the debacle at the Oval Office, and it seemed that President Zelensky was much more conciliatory than at that event. And there was obviously an interview with Trump, and he seemed to be pulled back a little bit, not that much, but a little bit as he was getting onto his airplane. It's quite possible that this sort of crazy day that should have taken place behind closed doors will be kind of glossed over, and they'll go back to as if it had taken place behind closed doors, and things proceed as they were about to. I mean, that's maybe a positive spin. Now, it doesn't look good if the sides harden and that agreements are lost, and it goes on for another 6 months or a year. So this seems, like Paul said, this seems to be a critical moment, and it might be repairable because everybody's seen that picture of the Ukrainian advisor, diplomat, who hangs who drops her head in her hands after hearing what her president has just said in the Oval Office, and she probably was a professional diplomat, and so knows that this wasn't good. But maybe we can repair this.
Well, I wonder what she thinks he should have done. You know, I mean, he has to push back in some way or other. But since the agreement for rare metals was not signed, and maybe kind of dropped for the moment, it looks like Trump may start to focus on rare metals available in Canada, and that isn't very cheerful from the Canadian point of view. Just more pressure.
I'd like to remind us that there's another war going on. We've only talked about the one that was, such a headline maker yesterday, but there's such a thing as Gaza. Remember that? We better give that some thought, because I don't know what to do with that one either.
I thought you were going to talk about Sudan.
Sudan, we won't even get to Sudan. I'll be happy if we can even make any progress thinking through what to do about Gaza.
Well, it appears that some Gazans think that because of the ceasefire, there should have been some progress toward rebuilding, which seems kind of excessive thinking and far too optimistic. But anyway, that was a sort of news item of today. But where else is the money going to come from to rebuild? Where?
I wonder, if we think that Trump is driven by personal ambition and ego and not political realism. To a certain extent, what happens in the United States domestically will affect some of these conflicts, including Gaza, but maybe not quick enough. I mean, not the by-elections, but the what am I talking about? The elections next year in Congress. Midterms is what I'm trying to think of. These could flip Trump. Not that he's relying extensively on the legislature. He's doing much by executive order, but these could flip. That could change. And I was looking at some polling that came out, and even though he was 50-50 support of opposition, as according to some time in the election, when asked about the specific policies like tariffs, like taking over Gaza, across the America as a whole, not in terms of partisanship, went 55, 60% opposed, 30% in support versus, do you think Trump is doing a good job or doing what you expected? That would be 50-50. So that's a good sign. This is a very recent polling, credible polling, and a credible pollster, I should say, suggesting that the public is maybe a little disconcerted. I'm kind of wondering. I want to see what the polling is for what happened yesterday, and see whether the public is going to put some pressure on. I mean, we haven't seen demonstrations of tens of thousands of people in the streets yet. Does Trump care? Maybe not, but if he loses some support in Congress, that might be a positive thing, and that's coming next year.
Robin, when you say that you're citing polls, recent ones,
Sure.
do those polls talk about their attitude toward Ukraine?
I didn't see Ukraine in the polling in the ones that I skimmed it, to be honest. I think there were four key policy positions. Tariffs, very much against the tariffs. Gaza, very much against Trumpistan being established in Gaza, U.S. taking over Gaza. I can't remember what the other two were either, but those are the ones that struck out. I know one of them was actually on the sort of DEI policy, which is kind of interesting because there was more opposition to his policy of eliminating all the DEI policies in government, at least. But there was a large percentage of unknown, uncertain. So combined with those who were in support of his policy, that was stronger than those who were opposed to what he was doing. So the other way around, actually. So that was interesting because I'm one of those people who thinks that some of those identity issues enabled his election. I think it played a major role. And so when we see the American public shifting on some of these things, that may bring good things.
What about USAID?
That was the fourth one. They were also critical of that, and there was another public government institution that they were concerned with as well. So those are all good.
What about all the things that Musk is doing with his wrecking ball?
Actually, there was concern about Musk being in charge. Yes, that was another. Did you see that poll by chance? Because you came up with the ones I've forgotten.
I mean, it's somewhat at unease with Musk, at least. It just looks to me like Musk is as much power as Putin. As Trump at the moment. It seems kind of an equal partnership, of course, where the second one wasn't even elected, and who knows the future, what Musk will do over the next period. Maybe he'll be dominant.
Well, he's disrupting services that will time impact ordinary Americans, and I think that may move the dial and matter against the Trump administration and his role. Not to mention that he's managed to provoke a tsunami of lawsuits, some of which are going to lead to rulings against his policies. But I wanted to say, because I'm conscious we're in our last few minutes, to refer to nuclear disarmament, which is, of course, a longstanding goal of the Canadian Pugwash group. And just to note that maybe it's a bit of a silver lining in these dark clouds, that some kind of resumption of a U.S.-Russian strategic dialogue could be helpful in achieving some near-term progress on the arms control and disarmament front. Thinking specifically at a resumption of negotiations for a follow-up to the New START treaty from 2010, which is the only extant legal constraint on the nuclear arsenals of Russia and the United States. And you may recall under the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, offered discussions with both Russia and China without preconditions about reductions. But the line from Moscow, he was rebuffed, basically saying, well, the U.S. is intent on promoting our strategic defeat, I think was the language used in Ukraine. There can't be any question of resuming those negotiations. Well, with these changes the Trump administration is bringing in, including this kind of rehabilitation of Moscow, it might permit action on this front, and that could conceivably yield some progress on this vital, if long neglected, disarmament file.
Dell, you mentioned a while back, you asked this rhetorical question, who's going to pay for rebuilding Gaza? Well, I was watching something where Ezra Klein it was a very good conversation with Fareed Zakaria this morning. And Zakaria said that there's never been any question among the Arabs that they fully intend to pay for the rebuilding of Gaza. The issue is not about whether or how much or anything like that. It's about who's going to control Gaza. And that is yet to be worked out. And clearly, so far as I can tell, I don't see any movement one way or another on that issue. I mean, can somebody bring me up to date on what I have missed? Because if there's any new conversation about the solution to the Gaza conflict, I haven't heard it. I'm just plain not aware of any development, and you can't stay this way forever. You've got to come up with something.
Well, the international standard is 67 borders. Whether that's going to happen in the near future is it's not going to happen in the near future. While Israel and U.S. are seeing eye to eye on things, it doesn't look like it's going to happen at all, at least certainly during Trump's reign.
But apparently, from the standpoint of the Arab countries, if
they need security guarantees as well. I mean, it's not unlike the Ukraine situation. Is that Israel needs to be confident that their borders aren't going to be breached, and Palestinians need to be ensured that something happens across the border into Israel and all hell breaks loose and another Gaza happens. That's I mean, Peggy has a proposal for an interim arrangement where the UN is authorized by the UN and watched over by the UN, but we're not there. I mean, there's insufficient political support for that at the UN, and Security Council has to be in agreement for this to take place. So.
Yeah, but I'm just asking who's going to govern Gaza. I mean, Zakaria says, if Israel won't allow any part of Hamas to have a role in it, then of course they have to leave it up to the West Bank, the PLO people and so on, and that is such a bad outfit. But either if they won't accept either one, then the Israelis would like to have the Arab countries govern Gaza, but the Arab countries don't want to govern Gaza.
So
that's the question: who's going to be the government of Gaza?
The proposal was a transitional authority. The trouble is that it's such a large region. Well, it's not that large compared to some countries, but it's such a large problem There has to be international support for a transitional authority, and it could last for decades before the two sides are willing to agree. I mean, that's why I brought it back to, there is an international agreement out there as to what the baseline is supposed to be, and we're so far from it. But that is still the international standard. An international a transitional authority governed or administered by the UN could have all sorts of states involved, including Arab states who would, I'm sure, Arab states would be willing to be involved if there was a UN transitional authority. But we're not there yet. But like we know what the pieces are. We just don't have the political acumen or the political will to proceed in that direction at this point. So it's hard to make prognosis, when the politics isn't in play. It's almost the worst situation right now. I mean, I just saw a picture of Gaza, from the air looking down a road. One of the UN agencies had the picture up, and it's like it looks like Hiroshima.
Yeah, I think you probably know that there's the Palestinian governance side is the question mark. I mean, you can talk about 67 borders, but the issue has always been, well, what about the other parts of Palestine? They've been under Jordanian control, they've been under Egyptian control, they have under currently Israeli control. But what form can a Palestinian entity capable of governing can come about? And as we know, the Palestinian Authority was present in Gaza until 2007, when basically they were forced out after a little internecine conflict with Hamas. And it's been convenient for Netanyahu and company to sort of have that divide and rule approach, where there's a Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, there's been Hamas in the Gaza, and neither are really reconciled to one another. So it's weakened that whole element. And yet there's been always, what's the day after? Netanyahu talks in vague terms of total victory, but we all see the Hamas militants still seem to have the armed control of Gaza. And it would take a fairly robust security force, wherever it came from, to be able to, in a sense, assert authority in that territory, including, being able to crush any armed uprising by Hamas. So that is a real conundrum. As Robin relayed, deep pockets in some of the Arab states, but how many of them are actually prepared to field armed forces to affect support for whatever governance entity is agreed upon? So we're a long way from, unfortunately, a solution there. As you know, there was supposed to be a second phase of the ceasefire operative. In fact, the first phase terminates today. They are talking about this, but as I understand it, the immediate proposal on the table is that they simply extend in time the first phase rather than tackle the second phase, which was to also involve the complete evacuation of Israeli forces from Gaza, and presumably some sort of agreement on the new government structure. And we don't seem to be, even near the serious negotiation on that.
Well, is anybody taking seriously still this absurd proposal by Trump that you clear out all of the Palestinians and turn it into a spa on the Riviera, like he was going to own it, and I don't think anybody took it seriously. It sounded laughable, and I think he's probably given up on it. But where did that go? At least not Netanyahu didn't object to it at all. He'd be happy enough to get the Palestinians ethnically cleansed, and whatever happens to them beyond that would be pleasing to him, I think. But has anything? I mean, I assume that thing just dropped like a lead weight and will never be heard of again. Am I right?
But what does Israel think of that? I'm not sure that we even know, but what does Israel think of the other part of Palestine? They seem to be just turning the screws and not leaving them alone, and there seems to be no international pressure to treat them decently. They just, they're moving in with more settlements. They're destroying farmers' crops, and they're doing all sorts of things that Israelis are doing to the other part of Palestine. It seems they'll just think they have carte blanche to do even more when they don't have to bother with Gaza anymore. So somebody needs to protect them.
Of course.
I think we're all waiting for some dissent to appear, both in Israel, effective dissent, and in Palestine, so that a compromise can be made, so that there's confidence that a government in Palestine isn't going to attack Israel down the road. I mean, it's not because, as Paul said, Israel will take advantage of any incursion, and Netanyahu is facing some legal issues once this war is over, so he probably wants to prolong this as much as possible. So it's another one of those stalemates.
So, but I give the floor to anybody who has something special you want to add. Otherwise, we can say goodbye. By the way, how would you like to do this more often? And we don't need to decide it here, but I was thinking maybe it'd be nice to have a Pugwash meeting as a forum once a month or every couple of months, and especially invite Pugwashites from other countries to join us, because we should have more contact that way. So I'll be proposing that to you. Give it a little thought.
Thanks for convening this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. See you again soon. Be well. Okay.
Well,
Bye.